Great. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for what we hope will be a very engaging and exciting panel on the very emotive subject of the business of education. We know you have a vast array of different subjects to look at, but I think this is one that has caught the eye of many investors, operators, and regulators alike, some of whom we have in the room today. So I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Ashwin Assomul. I'm a partner at Parthenon's international education practice. We work with private operators, investors, and governments across the world, helping them with building quality education systems internationally. I'm joined by an amazing panel today, and I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves. Andrew.
My name's... person who forgot to put his mic on. My name's Andrew Fitzmaurice. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Nord Anglia Education. We have 35 schools around the world in 14 countries, 24,000 students, 5,000 teaching and teaching support staff, and I've been CEO at the organization for 12 years now.
Good afternoon. Dino Varkey, I'm the Group Executive Director of GEMS Education and a board member. GEMS Education today, 55 years of heritage and track record. Today we are the largest K-12 education company through the GEMS portfolio of schools across 19 countries, as well as the work that we do in India through 2 subsidiaries. We have the privilege of educating 250,000 children from 170 different nationalities each and every day. It's something that we're tremendously proud of as a family, and obviously through our foundation we look to further our mission, which is trying to put a quality education within the reach of every child in every community that we serve, and we're pleased that we have the opportunity to do that and to put up a setting like this through this forum that actually gathers together all of the most important people in addressing what we believe is the most significant challenge that we have to face today, and that's solving the education crisis. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to all of you for being here.
Thank you. My name is Michael Watt, and I'm a recovering academic. Currently, I'm the chairman of BASIS.ed, which is an organization firm co-founded with my very talented wife, who is here today, Olga Block. BASIS.ed started as a single charter school in the most unlikely of places, the middle of the American desert, Tucson, Arizona. And from that one school, almost 2 decades ago, we now have 18 schools, 2 of which are independent schools, one in New York City and one in Silicon Valley, and then 15 charter schools around the United States. We have 12,000 students at last count and about 1,000 employees. It's a minnow compared to my colleagues here, but rising fast, I hope. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it is a pleasure to be here. James Tooley, professor at Newcastle University. That's my sort of day job. But in my spare time, I'm really fascinated by this phenomenon of low-cost private schools, which is burgeoning all over the world. I've been studying it, writing about it, and in the last few years creating chains of low-cost private schools. The one that I'd like to talk about today is Omega Schools. I co-founded Omega Schools in Ghana. We grew to about nearly 40 schools, nearly 20,000 enrollment in about 4 years. We're doing something similar in Sierra Leone, just started in Honduras and India. But also I like to champion these schools. And so I've been helping found federations of low-cost private schools around the world, including one in Nigeria, which has 3,000 schools, 600,000 students, called AFED, the Association of Formidable Education Development. A lovely Nigerian name. It's great to be here.
Good afternoon. My name is John Iossifidis, and I'm the Executive Vice President for Corporate and Investment Banking at Mashreq Bank. That's my day job. And in my personal time, up until very, very recently, I was actually on the board of governors of a not-for-profits primary school here for a considerable number of years. So I have both the business and and on the governance side of education.
Great, and I'll start with an open question. I'd like each panel member to respond. And it's really in relation to some of the reactions that we get as Parthenon as we move across the planet working in different geographies to the concept of for-profit and private sector operating in education. So folks come to us and say, education is a public good. You know, it is vulgar almost to see operators and investors making money from this. So I'd love, we've got two of the CEOs from the largest school companies in the world. Maybe we can start with you, Andrew, and then Dino. How would you respond to that?
Well, my argument would be that the private sector has done an enormous amount of good for education. I would, I think, put a challenge really to government to create an environment where the private sector can be more effective in the world of education. The thing is you know, the people from perhaps the commercial world understand well, which is not always well understood by politicians, is that markets in of themselves are actually, you know, quite delicate things. And in order to create a sustainable market and to create expertise and to create capacity, you need to get a degree of stability, and you also need to be able to see out for a fair period of time that you're going to have that stability and that level playing field in order to invest. And certainly my experience with having run a lot of different contracts for governments, you know, across Asia, Middle East, the UK, is that just as you start to get good at it and start to really deliver a lot of value and get fantastic outcomes for students, that's when the goalposts get moved on you by the government. And then you find that, you know, you've created this capacity with all these great people who now know exactly what they're doing and how to do it, and are adding tremendous value, and then the government decides for political or fiscal reasons perhaps that, you know, everything's changed. And I think, so for me, whilst the challenge is often made to the private sector about, you know, what is it that you're adding in terms of value, for me, having, you know, been doing this for 12 years now in a lot of different parts of the world, my challenge would much more be back to government to say, how can you get the private sector to make a greater impact?
For us, it's always been a simple equation. And I've said this a lot when I speak. Today, if we consider the scale of the challenge, and it's always good to set the context for everybody here, we know that there are 52, 57 million young people that are not able to access universal primary education. We know that there are another 150 that are forced to opt out of secondary provision around the world. We know that there are 700 to 800 million young people, women, girls, that don't have the literacy or the numeracy levels in order to access work. Then you look at accelerating population growth dynamics, specifically within emerging markets, and again, the examples that I've historically used are, you look at Brazil, Russia, India, China, just to keep pace with the incremental population growth, you would need to add every year 10,000 schools. So in the face of such a great challenge, and it's a challenge that's actually accelerating away from us, what's very clear for us is that governments on their own cannot fund this demand. Governments on their own cannot move quickly enough to cater to this demand. Right? And frankly, from our perspective, we just don't have the time for the traditional intellectual debates about public versus private. We just don't have that luxury anymore. So for us, what we believe is that our future is going to be secured, at least as far as education is concerned, through unleashing the very, very powerful potential collaborations between governments, private sector, the voluntary or the NGO space. And actually, at the end of the day, in emerging markets where perhaps governments aren't as mature, they don't have necessarily the same resources, actually private sector will step in anyway because there is a need that needs to be fulfilled. So for us, I think that's where the future lies. And realistically, we need all of us, all the actors within the education space, to function as efficiently and as effectively as possible if we're to make any level of systemic improvement in terms of the challenge.
That's an interesting point. We'll come back to how government should interplay with the private sector later on in the debate. Michael, some of your thoughts to that statement.
I think I would go back to my background as an economist and be somewhat contrarian and try to answer the question in its fundamental sense. And I think if you look at who the potential players are going forward in the education space, there's the government, there are nonprofits, there's the for-profit sector. The contrarian part is I actually think the for-profit sector has less conflicted goals than all the other actors. I mean, if you look at the government, and this is probably something that will follow me after I say it, but there's a problem, there's a contradiction between democracy and excellence in education. Because if you think about the way, and I don't have any experience at non-democratic governments. I have some experience at what we term as a limited democratic government. That if you look at the decision process, a majoritarian decision process is not one that's going to give you either universality or excellence. And to the extent I think that government schools have been successful, even in democracies, is they've been enabled to insulate themselves from the majoritarian process. So I don't think, actually, that you can expect now, as we have really more majoritarian governance in this world, and that's a good thing. I think it brings along with it the possibility that some functions of government now will not live up to expectations. Let's just think about the decision process. Now, if you look at nonprofits, which are private, but don't rely on the profit motive, there's very good theory about why you have nonprofits. They're supposed to waste money on the mission. That's why you have nonprofits. That's the logic of nonprofits. Well, the problem, I think, that we've observed, at least in the United States, and I think this is more general, is that nonprofits usually waste money on their executives and on things that are not associated with the mission. Now, then you come to the final actor and sort of the least popular actor in the public space, and that is the for-profits. And they have a very simple set of goals. That is, and if you look at for-profits who are concerned with the long run, they're concerned about their brand, they're concerned about the customers, who are basically the parents sending their students to the schools. So I think they actually have the strongest incentives to produce good education and universal education. And the rise of the low-cost networks in Africa is an astounding testament to how powerful this mechanism is. It isn't only the elite. You know, we're targeting ourselves mid-scale, high middle-income schools. But the African example seems to me to be really powerful because they're using markets in a place where you'd never think it could be used. So it seems to me that the question is really upside down. Really, if we were sensible, we'd be asking the question, why is the government and nonprofits still involved in education? So I'll leave it at that.
The problem being the second to last answer to your question is I wholly endorse what Michael said last. The question is the wrong way around. The question which got at be asking is why are governments involved in education? The situation, you said if someone says for-profit motive is vulgar, the for-profit motive is absolutely good in education. It brings in innovation, it brings in investment, it allows people to go to places that were otherwise underserved. It's wholly a good. My work in some of the poorest parts of the world, in some of the poorest parts of those poorest parts, very clearly demonstrates that the arguments that are given for why government should be involved in education just don't hold water. So government is a public good, you said. Well, actually, as the economist would tell you, education is a public good. As the economist would tell you, education is actually more likely a private good with externalities. And one of the externalities might be equality of opportunity or equality or equity or social justice. If you look around the world and see how governments are catering for the poor, you'll never think that government has a role there at all. Government schools for the poor are often very inadequate. Teachers don't turn up. If they do turn up, they don't teach, and so on. The private sector can come into those spaces and transform education. So I agree with Michael, and of course the previous panelists. The question is the wrong way around. We must never allow people to wrest the moral high ground away from the private sector, including the private for-profit sector.
John, anything to add?
Maybe some statistics. I guess I think there's a role to play for everybody. In the UAE, approximately a fifth of the federal government budget is on education, so it is big business. And the private education system in the UAE is around about $1.9 billion, which is, again, big business, and it's bigger than China. So there's clearly a role to play for the government and for the private sector to be working together.
Great. And I'm going to stay with you for the next question. We'd love a banker's view on what you feel is so attractive around working with education companies. I know you work with several, but what makes it a particularly attractive investment for a banking institution like Mashreq?
Well, I think there's a number of ways of looking at it. From the point of view of a commercial bank, they like dealing with long-term stability of income. They like dealing with businesses where at the end of the day you have negative working capital requirement. You know, the fees for schools are paid upfront, right? So the working capital requirements aren't there. It's a very stable form of income, and it also gives us the ability to take a long-term view on the schools and the developing of schools as we progress along. So that's number one. I think the second thing is when you look at it from a private equity point of view or an investment point of view, there was a survey done in 2014 in terms of the top 3 sectors of interest for investors. The first one was actually retail. The second one was healthcare. The third one was actually education. So investors are looking at this sector as well from the point of view of stability of returns and a long-term income source.
Do you know anything to add as a private equity-backed school company?
Look, I think certainly it is resilient. And I think fundamentally investors do want a long-term position. Do I see that across the world in terms of where investors truly understand that education by its very nature should be a long-term investment, that it is infrastructure that's critical to building the future of a nation? No, we're not seeing that enough. I think the maturity of knowledge amongst investor pools is still not there. And obviously it's different in different contexts. It's going to be different if you're a private company versus if you're a public company. And the level of scrutiny and the time horizons are significantly different. But at the end of the day, I think it's proved its resilience. I think it's the nature of, again, the demand, if you just take the numbers that I articulated at the beginning, is such that there is opportunity for the education sector and players within the education sector to continue to grow in various markets across the world.
I'd like to move the subject forward to talk a little bit about innovation. And James, I think what we've observed in some of our work in Africa is it's actually in the low-cost sector that you see some of the greatest innovations in for-profit education. Could you share some of your experiences with us?
Yeah, and some of the innovations are incredibly simple. So in Omega Schools, which I co-founded with Ken Donko in 2008, 2009, we wanted to serve the poor. And we recognized that the cash flow of the poor is daily. And we talked to parents about why they couldn't send their children to private schools. And we were told that the fee, although the school fees are quite low in the areas we're working in, maybe $5 or $6 a month. These are existing low-cost private schools. Typically, the schools will have a fee, a termly fee, so you've got to save up $15, $18, $20, and then you get hit for uniforms, books, and so on. And so poor parents would say, we couldn't do this. We can't afford this, so they go to government school, they send their children to government school, or they're out of school altogether. And so this is innovation. So we're sort of thinking, well, how can we better serve the market? Let's create an all-inclusive daily fee. All-inclusive, which means no parent has to find any other additional cost, not for lunch, not for uniforms, not for books, not for anything else. And daily, they literally pay daily. So that is an innovation, very simple. It's very simple innovation, nothing to do with technology or anything like that. But immediately, it opened the school to parents who thought they couldn't afford government schools. And in our early schools, we were finding roughly 40-40-20. 40% of our parents came from other private schools, 40% came from government schools, and 20% were out of school. The children were out of school. They now realized that with this little innovation, they could afford schooling. And then we did further innovations around this by saying, okay, it's difficult now collecting that cash every day. We want cash-free schools. Again, I'm going to describe, we obviously do high-tech innovations as well, but a low-tech innovation. Because if you're working in Africa, if you can get away with low-tech, it's much better. You know, bandwidth, electricity is a problem with anything technological. So we said, okay, there are difficulties with collecting money. We don't want anyone to be tempted with cash in the school. So we then employed local entrepreneurs, local business people, to sell a Get Into Omega school card in the community, just like you sell charge cards for phones. These entrepreneurs were selling them, so you could buy an Omega card in the community. You could also buy it at the school gate from an entrepreneur. And this then helped us, a low-tech way of really increasing access. And we've obviously got lots of innovations about quality as well, but I've spoken too long. Yeah.
Great. Michael, anything around innovation in the US specifically where you operate?
Well, I think that the motive to do better with the resources that you have has resulted, in our own case, in the charter schools and now in the independent schools, of doing a better job, really, of getting the faculty to coordinate and construct curriculum material and assessment material by using, better software, developing better software. And I think it is the for-profit nature of this that encourages it, because you can capture the results. This is really important idea, that you can capture the results of your innovation. And there's a discussion this morning about the fact that one of the fears about for-profit and private activity in the education space is that there won't be free dissemination of information. Well, to some extent, information and these technologies are public goods. The problem with it is that public goods will be underprovided unless you have some way to actually capture the benefits. So information is underprovided if you don't have a mechanism by which to monetize it. I mean, that's why we have under-provision of news services, because you need mechanisms. And so I think in the for-profit sector, we're able to capture, for my purposes, not enough yet, but we're able to capture the benefits of developing software to do a better job of having teachers collaborate and exchange information. Granted, it's inside our network, but that's a way of capturing it. It'll be there forever.
Let's come on to talk a little bit more about the markets that you are operating in and that you are looking to expand into. I know, Andrew, you have a very geographically diverse set of schools focused on British curriculum at the premium end. I know you've had success in China, but which other areas are you looking at as part of your expansion strategy?
Well, being a public company, that's quite a difficult question to answer. But if I perhaps say more generally, I'm always reminded of does anyone know a company called Laureate, which is the massive post-secondary business? And someone asked the founder of Laureate that, Doug Becker, and it was a similar audience, filled with investors and competitors. And Doug said, well, why don't you try Bermuda? And then in 5 years' time, if that works, come back and I'll give you another. So for me, that's, it is quite a difficult question to say where next. Certainly, where have we seen a lot of growth is in the emerging markets. Southeast Asia, China, although serving the expats, and it's been on the general growth of the economy in China. But I think it's just the prioritization by parents of education for their children is the thing that we're benefiting from. And what I often, talk to people about is because, of course, everyone wants to understand the world in these big, geographic swathes. But in our world, in the world of international schools, it's very much about each individual city. And sometimes a city is very well served. In America, there are many cities. I was talking to Michael just before we came in about tremendous success that he's had in San Jose. Sometimes there are cities that are wonderfully well served with great schools. Other times there are cities that just aren't well served with great international schools. So for us, there's a massive opportunity out there. I think the other thing that we're seeing a lot of is local students wanting to come into an international school. And I was struck by that when I was talking to a teacher at our school in Madrid recently, and the school in Madrid is doing really well. And I said, why do you think that is, given how difficult the economy is here? And he said, well, I think, Spanish parents in particular are starting to think that they're going to need more than just a local education, that they want more for their children, and they think that an international education is going to provide them with more opportunity.
Great. And do you know which areas are exciting, Jen?
Look,
That's much of the
Bermuda.
secret strategy.
If you've got a pen and I'll just...
Yeah, look, we've always talked about it and we've been consistent in the way that we've described it. The reality is every community that we can serve, students and families, we will be there. Over what period of time, it depends entirely, but certainly in what we're doing in the developed markets, it's always been a strategy where we want to ensure that we're able to serve that community, but there's a halo effect of having those schools in what emerging markets perceive as the traditional hubs for education. So it is important for us to have schools in the US and the UK and Switzerland because there is that perception. But truly, where are we having the most impact as an organization? It's emerging markets. That is where you see an incredible aspiration amongst families because for want of anything else, and perhaps they don't necessarily have a public education system that's catering to them, that's able to cater for them, they're desperate for a high-quality education, and they're willing to make incredible sacrifices in order to be able to send their children to the schools that are able to provide that. And frankly, when we look at whether it's South Asia, East Asia, parts of Africa, it's common, right? Those families are willing to sacrifice an incredible amount. And we're fortunate that we are able to have different types of schools for different communities. We've always had that skill and competency. And certainly, where we expect to have the most impact is amongst the local populations of particular countries. That's where I think the most significant opportunity presents itself for us.
I'm going to ask one last question before I open it to the floor. And maybe I could start with you, James. It's a very, again, a very emotive subject around how the government should interplay with the private sector. So in markets across the GCC, we see the regulators getting involved in setting fees and regulating fees. Of course, there's a lot of involvement around quality assurance. In your experience, which systems have worked well, and how should the government really get involved with the private sector?
Yeah. So the chain of schools that I'm working with in Ghana, Ghana is a great country for the regulatory environment. It really works very well. Other countries in West Africa are also very good. The one that breaks my heart at the moment is India. India has introduced an act, the Right to Education Act, which sounds wonderful. It sounds as though it's along the right lines, but it is causing low-cost private schools, that's my area, low-cost private schools, it is causing these to be closed. They're forcing the closure of these schools because the regulations there are all about inputs. And the inputs are things like, have you got a large enough playground? Do you pay your teachers the same as the government schools, and so on? And the whole model of low-cost private schools just can't survive on those sort of regulations. So the government is closing down thousands of low-cost private schools, throwing the kids out of those schools, and yet their parents have already seen the government schools. They don't want their children there. They've moved them to these low-cost private schools. Hundreds of thousands of kids are being thrown out of those schools, having to go back to government schools where the facilities are often worse than these schools. So those are particular examples. West Africa is a wonderful place to invest. India is quite a disturbing place at the moment. But in general, you talked about governments regulating fees, governments regulating all these things. I just wonder why government thinks it has the authority or the adequacy to get in and regulate those things. We don't want governments regulating the price of bread, the price of shirts. We don't want governments coming in and saying, you've got to open these hours or you've got to have these sort of inputs for other areas of our lives. I think education is far too important to be left to governments to regulate. I like to see much more impetus given to what? The accountability to parents. People, when they talk about regulation, always talk as if they assume the only sort of accountability you can get is accountability to governments. No, there's a much better form of accountability in education. It's accountability to children and their parents, and that can work very, very well to keep standards high as long as you've got competition in the market.
John, you're based in the region, so I think you'll have a view on this, given what you hear from the regulators. So what?
Well, I've been, yes, from what I hear from the regulators, but I think I've also, as I said, worked for not-for-profit, and they do regulate your fees and things like that, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think the regulation is not something that governments should be getting involved with. But maybe you asked, your question was, what should they be doing? Maybe they should actually be providing support by way of, this is the budget, grants of land, or to allow operators to then develop and build a school. Maybe it should be around, if they want to make it more accessible, if they grant even the private schools a fee per student to help them and bring down the costs for the private schools. So what they're doing is not so much regulating, but supporting the education system, both in private and public school systems.
UAE is a great example.
Yeah. And Michael, from the US, are there any lessons that we could learn around regulation?
Wow.
How not to do it.
How not to do it, right? I mean, the example I have is the charters, which are like, I think, British free schools, and there are models like it all over the world. They're essentially private companies contracting to do public education. That's coming under much more assault in the United States. So we started in Arizona. It's characterized in the rest of the world as cowboy capitalism, and I thank God for that. But the least regulated state is now moving towards regulating the charter area. And it started very free, and they're regulating it. We have wanted to expand for years now, and can only find about 4 states in the United States that we can actually manage charter schools. We need enough freedom, and there are only about 4 states and they're contracting, not expanding. So I mean, I think and we're consequently moving out of the charter management area and trying to poach on these fellows.
That's okay.
And both inside the United States, because I think there is a market there, and I think there the regulation surprisingly is light, because they haven't, I guess, concentrated on that yet. So that's a very good place, I think, to put schools. There's a lot of competition from good privates and publics, but the market is very large, and the government is doing a very bad job of educating upper middle class and middle class kids. So I think the market is growing, and there you find not very much regulation. The regulation you have there is all this local nonsense about zoning and stuff. But I think the lesson is, if you want to start something like free schools in other places, there's this problem over time that the government just drifts to increasing regulation and stifling the growth of competition to its own schools. I mean, it's not surprising to me that the government in India is protecting its own schools. I mean, so there are lessons. The American example in charter schools, I think, is an example of how a good idea morphs over time to look like every other regulatory program.
Great.
I was just going to add something, because it almost always gets mentioned at a conference, but it hasn't been, so it just feels as if I should say it. If we were at a healthcare conference, I'm not sure this question would ever be asked. Is there a role for private sector within healthcare, or the role of business within the healthcare sector? And that just shows that we're just a little bit more immature as a sector in terms of the debates and the conversations that we're having. The reality is there's a pressure and an inevitability about where we need to move to. I just think we need to build some consensus along the way, but that's probably the simplest adage to end on before we move to the floor.
Sure. So we'd love to open it to the floor. I think there should be a mic. Could we? Yeah, I don't think there is a mic. You can just shout out.
Hi, my name is Rashid Al-Tayyib. I'm a partner of Mizan leading our education practice. I've seen with great interest the growth of private schooling, particularly in this part of the world, in the GCC, and believe strongly in its role. And congratulations to Jen for being a leader in that space. I was wondering if you could tell me whether you have a view on, given that the public education systems in the region are where some of the most challenging issues are, do you see a role for yourself as private school providers in helping give back and improve the public education systems in the region?
Absolutely. In fact,
and what would that role be?
Look, absolutely. I think from our perspective, and it's certainly high-level conversations that we've had internally about how we can potentially support the public sector here. I know that our regulators across the various emirates, specifically within Dubai, have already looked at and actually have embedded systems where they try and share best practice. So they pull together best practice from across the network and share more freely. The one that I typically like is a very simple hub and spoke model. Essentially, the idea that a private school can adopt is maybe the wrong word, but lend its expertise, whether it's around leadership, whether it's around great teaching, whether it's setting up joint student collaboration pieces of work. It doesn't take much, right? You could set up mentoring sessions between great school principals from the private sector with school leaders from public schools. It works in this setting in the Middle East. I mean, that would be a very simple mechanism to transfer best practice. Ensuring that teachers from public schools have access to the caliber of professional development that we do is something that I think would be valuable. I think the power of being able to get young people, whether they're in a public school or a private school, to come together and do something significant as far as their local community was concerned, do something that was arts related. These are all powerful, very, very simple collaborations and systems to set up in order to try and help, whether it was a public school or any other school. I think there is an onus on all providers of education, whether they're private or public, to share what they're doing, right, within the realm of reason. It's only going to be valuable for the sector more broadly, because there's more than enough demand, right? We're not in such an acute, highly competitive sector yet, and I don't think we'll ever get to that. There is enough demand out there where there's more than enough space, not just for the people sitting up on this tape, on this panel, but actually for new entrants to continue to come in. And that's only going to be to the benefit of the families and children that are able to benefit from that.
This question up here.
I'll just try to speak loud. Brian Ogov with Cognitas, maybe the number 3 behind these two guys. This question is more specific for Andrew because you're really the only listed K-12 group. And so my question is, have you sort of had any, maybe not negative repercussions, but since going public and let's say the transparency of profitability relative to being a private K-12 group, has there been any sort of change in that since going public?
No, I don't think there has. We were listed before in the UK up until 2008, and then we were private 2008 through 2014, went public again. I think that being public has been a positive thing for us, if anything, because one, you're much more visible to stakeholders, and so people know who you are, know what you are, and also that they're very transparent about the investment that you've got available to you. The idea of the public market is that you can tap on that if you need it. And certainly, we've seen, if anything, an increase in the number of opportunities for partnering, whether it's greenfields or any other type of partnership for schools than we saw before we were public. And I haven't seen any negative. I think going back to what James is saying. So, fundamentally, you'd have to say, do you believe that competition drives better outcomes for schools? So having been in it for a while, I would absolutely say yes, it does. Being in a competitive environment means you have to be good, otherwise you're not there tomorrow. Second thing is, does the profit motive, slightly more controversially perhaps, provide a better competitive model than other models which you may be able to create which don't use the profit motive to create competition? Well, I think pretty much if you looked across most things, you would say that yes, the profit motive does create the best model for competition. And I think that parents are just interested in the best possible education for their children. And that's what they're holding us to account for every day. And if we're delivering on that, we don't get a problem. If there are ever issues with that, then people are not going to hesitate to come and get hold of me or anyone else in the organisation about it.
Could I ask a follow-up to that? Being listed, does it create more pressure on you as a management team because you're answerable on a more quarterly basis rather than you were in a private equity setting? So there's just a more active tracking of performance. Does that create issues?
I think it's your responsibility as a management team, and as Dino alluded to, that education is a much longer-term business than people are used to seeing. We talked about the 3 sectors, retail being one. You can see a bunch of fashion victims on the stage here, all wearing very similar suits. But retail comes in and out of fashion; it can change very quickly. And we've got schools that are over 100 years old. So education has got a much longer horizon, and part of my job and other members of our management team's job has been to educate the investor that is the case. And certainly, if you look at our share register, it is a group of long-only people who are taking a much longer-term view about education and about the sector that we're serving. So I think it's about educating that. You do have the pressure of reporting quarterly. There's no doubt about that. And one of the great things about education, to hark back onto the public versus private thing again, one of the things that helps me sleep at night, of course, is that we're 100% private pay. Now, I've got numerous examples of where we're doing a wonderful job for governments, and we're building up a really significant business in a particular area, and then for whatever reason, often to do with, as I said, fiscal or political constraints, you're out. Now, that's a much more difficult conversation to have with an investor. Investors really don't like that. They really don't like surprises, and they don't like things which aren't particularly fair. So the good thing about our model is, I think it is pretty long-term, and it is pretty fair. So
Ash, sorry, just on that, I mean, as a financier to that, the discipline that actually comes with dealing with publicly listed entities, so the additional discipline from a financial discipline is something that we like to see as well. So it actually would help the situation and the cause.
Question there.
This is, I'm Mahendra from India. The question is to Mr. Tooley. The kind of regulations which you talked about in India, we see two types of scenarios. One which you talked about is regulations, too much of regulation and not helping education get into, private people get very easily into education domain. Second thing is there are private tutoring companies which are getting publicly listed, like MT Educare and Career Point and other. So my question to you is there a way by which we can convince governments to open up this sector so that there'll be more quality, as we have been discussing? And once the private people come into it, naturally the quality will come. So is there a way by which we can convince governments?
Yeah. I mean, we need evidence. All the time we need evidence. And there are great groups in India, like the Centre for Civil Society, like the India Institute. There's an organization called NISA, the National Independent Schools Alliance. I'm chief mentor of that excellent group, which are trying to bring evidence before the state and national governments to show, first of all, the number of children who are in these private schools. I haven't been able to emphasize here, this is a huge phenomenon. Rural India, 31% of children are in private schools. In urban India, it's probably 70%. These are massive contributions that are being made. And secondly, to show how these schools are better than the government schools. There's lots of evidence about that. There are studies being done on voucher experiments and so on to show that. So all this evidence helps, okay? And then there are stories that you've got to tell. If people are thrown out of private schools, then where are they going? Following those stories of individual children. This girl, Jayeshri, she was thrown out of a private school here. She's now going to a government school. There she had drinking water and a separate toilet. Here she has no drinking water and has to share the toilets with the boys, and so she's put off. There are those sort of human interest stories. There's data, and I think in the end, India has this problem of the license Raj, doesn't it? And some of the regulations just have to be unwound. India has a Supreme Court judgment dating back to the early 1990s, which outlaws for-profit education. So you have to have various difficult structures to make education companies work there. But I think the more examples you've got, I met someone earlier who's running a chain of schools in Rajasthan. Next to her is someone running a chain of schools in Gujarat. I know James is doing some really exciting things in India. I think the more evidence of good practice that we can contribute and show that this sector is not to be afraid of, this sector is going with the grain of parental choice, the better it will be. But it'll be an uphill struggle. But I think the more people unite and fight for the rights of parents to choose the education they want for their children, the better.
Question from the lady in the white jacket. We'll come to you in a second.
Hi, and thank you for all the perspectives that you all have brought to us today. I am an educator here in Abu Dhabi right now, and from the United States, I have experience also private sector, public sector, and charter schools. And there's pluses and minuses from the inside that I can see. But my question to you all is, in the face of no regulation of for-profit organizations, we're looking at good practice up here, but we can all agree that there's not good practice out there. How do we continue to protect the citizens of these cities and these countries? Because I think there's a certain part of government regulation that is trying to do that. Make sure that whoever they're bringing in is good for their citizens. As a parent, I don't have time to shop, take a chance, put my child in your school and you fail, put my child in their school and you fail, and keep going until I find the one that works. How do we continue to protect the for-profit realm from those bad guys? You guys have a history. You're the good guys. How do we protect it from the bad guys with no regulation?
So, let me just give you the viewpoint of somewhere that we operate that we believe is moving towards what we believe is going to be best practice globally. I think our regulator here has tried to create an enabling environment. It's tried to encourage tier one competitors to come into the market. And like I said, I think competition is only for the benefit of parents and families. They have an inspection regime that, regardless of how it operates, makes very, very visible to parents the relative performance of schools within a system, right? And so again, that gives parents as much information as possible in order to choose. I think that's the move, and I think James alluded to it as well. I think governments certainly have a role to play if it's around ensuring quality of provision, but that's again looking at outcomes, looking at standards, looking at what happens at the end of the educational process. I think most immature regulatory systems that we encounter around the world, though, are incredibly fixated on the inputs.
Yeah.
And these are arbitrary inputs that are a bygone from the industrial era, right? Space per child, space in classrooms, qualifications that you expect to see in a particular teacher, so on and so forth. Whereas, again, in the context that we all operate in, the innovation is driven by the flexibility. I mean, I always like to think about, there are models out there today, and actually our foundation does one of them, where we're teaching 3,500 girls across Ghana. These are girls in rural communities that are taught by 5 teachers through a studio in Accra, right? There's no connectivity in these communities, so we use VSAT, so very small aperture terminals, solar powered. They can provide connectivity via satellite. They do a modified curriculum. The actual teachers that they have in those rural communities are probably not teachers. They're not, at least by the qualifications that you and I perhaps would have judged them by. And yet you should see what's being achieved. It is truly incredible. But we've been given the space to innovate in a place like Ghana, and I think fundamentally because these governments, because they don't necessarily have the same level of resources, they're crying out for any solution. Anything that will work, anything that will allow them to deliver a better quality of education to its citizens. And I think that's the refreshing thing that we certainly see in a lot of emerging markets, government sector conversations that we're having is they're willing to try. They're less entrenched in these, as I said, traditional intellectual debates that have gone on for decades and decades in more developed markets.
Isn't the development of brands really important in this? That's the real quality assurance, is the development of brands. I'm very distrustful, and I think other people ought to be distrustful of governments protecting their citizens against themselves. So brands really are a way, and the encouragement of the development of brands are a way of assuring quality where individuals can actually make their own decisions and parents can make decisions about their children. It's not foolproof, but government regulation is far from perfect and really usually leads to some restriction on entry. And being a minnow in this group, I'm sensitive to restrictions on entry, and having concentrated now for almost 2 decades on building a brand that we'd like to actually take forward, I'm a big proponent of brands. I mean, from our point of view, every time a head of school attempts to soften the standards, we're there because we don't want the brand spoiled. And I think that's a very powerful motivating force on our side, but very powerful market mechanism.
It is.
Do you want to add?
I mean, I was just going to say it's very important, the S on the end of brands, because competition is very important in this market. Competition and the brands, that can keep quality high because parents know, the providers know that parents can go elsewhere. I mean, you were talking in quite a sort of high-minded way about government regulations, where we've heard, I think, correctly that they can stifle innovation, they can stifle entrance into the market. But the converse, I mean, where do you go shopping? I go shopping in a supermarket which is part of one of 5 competing brands. There are food standards, of course there are there, but I know that my supermarket doesn't give me rotten eggs when I go to buy eggs because of the food standards. It gives me rotten eggs because if it makes me sick, I will not go back there again. And this is the same for the competitive market of education. The parents will sense what's going on in a school and not go back there if it's not satisfactory. So I think competition, brands, absolutely crucial.
And one question on the fourth row there.
Nafis Queen Rani Foundation. Touch on the issue of eggs and being spoiled and getting sick and not going back. One of the key principles that I guess we want to imbue in education and through the private sector is innovation. And one of the key principles of innovation is iterating quickly and failing fast. The problem is when you fail fast with somebody's education, how do you recover from that? You can't say, oh, sorry, Tommy's 5th grade math didn't work so well, we'll do it again next year. So my question is, how do you balance the need for innovation in education as a business and the need to protect such a sensitive commodity or whatever you're offering to them?
Well, I mean, one way in which governments regulate education, which falls into precisely the trap you're talking about, is they say the only way you can really judge the quality of education is to have a school leaving examination, and that's when you judge the quality. So in India, it's in class 10, in Ghana, it's class 9. So poor kids have 10, 12 years in schooling before they are then assessed by the school leaving examination, and then that's far too late. I mean, once you see, we're talking about markets which are generally, have been monopolies by government, and so the innovation in the private sector hasn't yet come in. So first of all, you'll have innovation where it won't be a life and death decision like that. You won't just have one provider for your education. That's a possibility. But secondly, you can get providers coming in with alternative assessment systems that enable you to have proximate assessments so you can judge very well how your school is doing, how your child is doing, without waiting for that government exam. I think of judo and music. I don't know if you know, those are private sector examinations that have 8 grades, 8 levels, 8 belts in judo, and there you can see how you're doing without waiting for the government's leisurely process of saying how well you're doing in the school. I think the private sector can do really well in the sector. If you allow it in, if you allow the innovation to come, you'll see some real transformation that will solve the problem you raise.
We have one last quick question at the back.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Beatrice Sanuta from Dowd Investment, a business group which has recently started venturing into the education space. My question is for the panel in general, and it is, do you think there are any subsectors within the education space that should not be open to for-profit business? And I'm thinking in particular, for example, of special needs education. And I have kind of an appendix question for Dino, which is, do you think that Dubai in particular is ready for for-profit special needs education?
Wow. Out of principle, I would say that no, you shouldn't close any avenue, right, for any level of education. Do I think more can be done around inclusion and provision of special needs? By the way, not just here, but everywhere in the world, absolutely. But because actually, if you look at the level of need, and if we look at the better we get around assessing specific types of needs in our young people, as a proportion, it is becoming larger. So I think we do need a systemic solution. I don't think it's necessarily something that any one actor can solve. Again, I'm still a big believer that you still need powerful collaborations across government sector, private sector, and the voluntary space in order to arrive at some of the solutions that we're talking about around special needs and inclusion. But it is incredibly important.
Andrew, would you like to comment? Because of
Well, if you look at the UK, that's the bit that's been outsourced the most.
Yeah. So in the UK, you can distinguish between the provider, which can be for-profit, but the funder, you see, can be someone else. And this goes back to the public-private partnership. If you've got kids who have terrific special needs where the parent or the child can't possibly fund that, then there's no contradiction between saying, okay, we'll have targeted funding, but a for-profit provider. There's no contradiction in that at all.
In fact, in the United States, in our experience, in the states we operate in, the most severely handicapped children are contracted out by the government to the private sector. So that is actually the sector that there's least debate about.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you to my panelists for that rich debate, and thank you to the floor for all the great questions. So if we could end with a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.